So, to our first speaker, John Ireland. I've written it on 2 pages, that's difficult. Deputy Director of Climate Change for Low Carbon Economy, a position he's held for over 5 years now at the Deputy Directorate of Energy and Climate Change for the Scottish Government. Also Policy Fellow for the Centre of Science and Policy at the University of Cambridge. John holds Master of Philosophy and BScs in Economics from Oxford University and London School of Economics. What really interests me in John's background isn't just that he is extremely well qualified for his position working in both economics and social change, but how his previous work in modelling social impact with economic business models that have gone forward to be used by the Bank of England and HM Treasury make me probably one of the keenest people to listen to him talk. So with no further ado, let me please welcome to the stage John Ireland.
Okay, good morning. First of all, an apology. I have to head off to the Parliament, so I'll not be able to participate in the panel discussion. So what we've agreed to do is that I'll speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have 5 minutes Q&A, so I get a chance to be grilled by you. What I'm going to do this morning is give you a bit of an update. Scotland's had a Climate Change Act since 2009. We have, as Dave said, a world-leading target of 42% reduction since 1990 in that act also contains a 2050 target of 80% reduction in emissions. The act contains an awful lot more than those targets, but people tend to focus on the targets. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a bit of an update on where we are with progress. At the same time, I think it's really important to recognize that the end of last year and this year is a pretty important time in climate change. We had the Paris Agreement at the end of last year, pretty significant. We've just had a Scottish election in which climate change is featured in the SNP's manifesto. We have a commitment from the First Minister to legislate on a new target, and we are doing a lot of work to develop our next carbon emissions reduction plan, commonly known as RPP3. So I'm going to talk about some quite high-level things. I'm not going to talk about the detail of what's going on the ground in Scotland. I'm going to leave that to others, and I think that Viv is going to give you a really good example of collaboration across the public sector in Scotland around infrastructure investment. So I leave that sort of stuff to Viv and others. I'm going to give you a bit of an update. So where are we so far? 2 weeks ago, the government produced its latest batch of statistics on emissions. They're for 2014. They lag a little bit. The really good news is that we met the interim target of 42% reduction and exceeded it with a 45.8% reduction in emissions since 1990. These are emissions adjusted for the operation of the ETS. So we met that annual target 6 years in advance. We also met the annual target for 2014. On the revised data, we met the annual target for 2013. So we now have a string of 5 annual targets. We just missed the 3 first of those targets, and we passed the second 2. And we now have a cumulative deficit of about 3.3 megatons. That's a matter of regret, of course, but the data is showing that things are getting much better. This time last year, the cumulative deficit over 4 years was 17.4 megatons. We've now reduced that to 3.3 megatons. So things are going pretty well, but that's not a reason to be complacent at all. I mentioned the Paris Agreement. As you will all probably know, there was this historic agreement at the end of last year, international, binding. It talked about reduction or keeping the increase in global warming to 2 degrees centigrade. It also talked about an ambition of 1.5 degrees. In response to that, the SNP manifesto contained a commitment to strengthen Scotland's ambition, moving to reduce actual emissions, so that's actual emissions as opposed to adjusted emissions, by more than 50% by 2020. So that's a strengthening of ambition. The First Minister has subsequently confirmed that the government will legislate to enact this. And a theme running through both the manifesto commitment and also the First Minister's commitment is that this will be evidence-based. We will rely upon evidence from our independent advisors, the UK Committee on Climate Change. The Cabinet Secretary for Climate Change has just written to the committee asking them for their advice about a new target. We are also in the process of developing our emissions reduction plan. This is known as RPP3. Emissions reduction plan, I think, actually describes what it is. This is the Scottish Government's plan of how emissions will be reduced in line with the targets up to 2032. It's going to be done on the basis of the current Act, although we are thinking about ways of making it clearer how new targets will impact upon that as well. There's a ministerial commitment to do this by the end of the year, and this report is a statutory requirement of the current Act. The other thing that we're working on at the same time is another ministerial commitment made before the election and confirmed after the election to produce a new energy strategy for Scotland. As you will all know, we had a new UK government elected just over a year ago. That's done a couple of things. In this space, it has made a number of changes to its energy policy which have seriously undermined the Scottish Government's previous approach to energy. In other words, the operation of renewables and the incentives for renewables have been dramatically reduced. There has been a walking away of commitments to carbon capture and storage. And it leaves energy strategy in Scotland in a different place. The energy strategy is going to focus upon the levers that we have already and will have under the new Scotland Act to influence energy consumption. So in other words, this is about demand reduction, energy efficiency, rather than decarbonising electricity supply. And the commitment is that that will be reduced on a roughly similar timescale to RPP3. The process for doing this sounds a bit techy. It's not. We have invested heavily in Scotland in an energy model. Now, most carbon emissions are, with the exception of agriculture and land use, come from burning fossil fuels. So having a good understanding about how we burn fossil fuels, how we generate energy, and how we use it is tremendously important in working out emissions reduction plan. We have invested in this model, which allows us to do this. It's an all-sector energy model. It's basically state-of-the-art stuff. It's an international framework for doing these things. We have an excellent group of consultants to build it for us, and we're now using it for real in developing the carbon reductions plan. It basically looks at our energy demands, sees how you can produce those, meet those energy demands in the least cost way, subject to the carbon constraints in the Climate Change Act or any others you might be interested in. It produces its output in terms of a series of times measures. These are basically things like how many electric vehicles you need, how many homes do you need insulated to certain standards, how many journeys need to be made by cycle versus car versus train versus bus. That sort of stuff, so it's very concrete. It allows us to produce an emissions reduction plan which is concrete and has a clear link between the measures you need to hit and hitting the targets. It also introduces a common currency for thinking about the energy strategy, and more importantly, in terms of the commitment to produce a new climate change target for 2020, it allows us to think about the consequences in terms of real on-the-ground actions of new targets. In other words, it allows us to have a sensible debate about those targets in terms of what needs to be done in Scotland, rather than plucking numbers from the air. Very important in our current parliamentary context. So, I think that's roughly me. So Dave, if you want to...
Yeah, please, John, if you want to come and... well, if you could stay there, I can ask for questions. We've only got 5 minutes for questions. Don't waste your time. Yeah, please.
David Somerville from Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation. I wonder if you could unpack this very last slide a little bit, and acronyms generally have come from somewhere, but I'm wondering if you could maybe expand on this last bit, because that's obviously very key to the future.
Yes, of course. So it is peppered a little bit with acronyms. The only real acronym there is TIMES, which is, I do not know what it stands for, I've been told, but I've forgotten. But TIMES is basically the name of the model, this all-energy model that I was talking about, which allows us to model how you meet your demands for energy in the least cost way for society, for Scotland, subject to your carbon constraint. So it allows you to think about how you will actually do stuff, how you will generate electricity, how you use fuel in transport, in heating homes, in heating non-domestic buildings, in the least cost way, and in the way which meets your carbon target. So it gives us a systematic framework for thinking about those things. The common currency is the fact that it's going to be all the output is in terms of on-the-ground things that you have to do, the examples I was giving earlier. And it allows us to think about the emissions reduction plan. An acronym there is RPP3, which many of you know, but an emissions reduction plan is basically what it says on the box. And it also allows you to think about the new 2020 target, the target which appeared, the commitment in the manifesto. So it's a way of thinking about a really important piece of work on planning our own emissions reduction, but also about thinking about new and more stretching targets.
John, on your model, have you allowed for using real data to integrate with that?
Yes. So the model is based upon the UK DEC model, which is based upon real data, and we have spent a period of about 6 months converting all that data into Scottish data. We had an advisory group of academics and also the environmental NGOs to help us in that process. It's a very, very data-based model.
And are you looking for feedback from this group who have more real data? We'll be streaming smart metering, we'll be collecting satellite imagery, etc.
So what we will be doing during the process of developing the reduction plan, and after the draft is published, we will have some of the model outputs in there. We're thinking about building a public version, a web-based version of the model, so people can play with it. And that sort of feedback based upon that sort of stuff is really helpful.
Public model would be brilliant. Yes, please.
My name is Derek Mills from DLM Research. In terms of your model, are you making it available to the technical companies and institutions so they can run their aspects of how they see the model running?
Yes, the previous Minister for Climate Change made a commitment that this would be an open source model. The DEC model, the UK government model, is open source as well. So we plan to make the model available. We've already run a session earlier this year, in which the model was explained to academics and other people who are interested. So the model will be made available in due course. There's nothing secret about it. And the other element of that is, as I said, we're developing an online version which is a simplified version which people can use in a web-based way.
Any more? Please, Gregor.
Hi, Gregor Patterson-Jones from the European Fund for Strategic Investment. These obviously have implications for public sector investment. So can you explain to us how the outputs of the model will result in commitments for funding for particular projects which will lead to, let's say, an increase of charging infrastructure or other projects?
So the emissions reduction plan will take the model outputs in terms of measures that need to be achieved in order to meet the carbon targets. And then individual parts of government will develop their plans for hitting those measures. So, for example, if there's a target about electric vehicle penetration, there are all sorts of infrastructure implications of that. There are all sorts of incentives behind that. And there are all sorts of regulatory implications of that, as well as behaviour change implications. And there is starting and ongoing a detailed process of policy development by individual parts of the Scottish Government to do that. And as the RPP is published, the emissions reduction plan, those policies will be provided in more detail. And of course, we will link this to the spending review, the infrastructure investment plan that the government has and updates, and of course it will also roll over into the work that Viv is doing with the infrastructure investment project.
John, can we stretch you for one more question?
Yes, of course.
At the front here, please. And that will be our last question.
Thank you, Martin Weert. Listening to what you're saying, it seems, and I applaud that the Scottish Government is focusing on emissions reduction in everyday life. But does this mean that you're also moving away from community-based and smaller scale electricity generation, or what is the Scottish Government doing to continue to encourage that despite the policies from Westminster?
I think that that's a really important part. I don't think that there's any sense that the government is walking away from that. In fact, I know from speaking to my colleagues in energy that that sort of community-based, small-scale decarbonisation is going to be an important part of the energy strategy as well. So, although the climate has become more difficult because of the UK government's action, I have no sense at all that the government is walking away from that community-based work.
Thank you, John. We're going to have to release you. You've got an appointment over the road immediately. And sorry, John can't stay for further discussions. And let's thank him in the usual way.